Hello there. Welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, where we journey together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher, and this is episode 143. We are in the greenhouse again with Dr. Tim Boswell, and we are discussing episode 142, which dealt with a very difficult, deep topic, which is about God's goodness and whether or not our hearts actually resonate and rest in God's goodness. And Kyle is off again this week. I guess we've given him like a month-long vacation. I didn't realize we had that policy, Doc. Are you aware that we had that policy?
I've never heard it extended to me.
Yeah. He's on his 2-week vacation in New York and Boston, I think. He might be traipsing around somewhere else in the Northeast. He and his wife and his family are up there. I was thinking the other day, I don't think I've ever taken a 2-week vacation in my 50-some years on this planet. Never.
I've taken like month-long vacations multiple times.
Really?
Yeah.
Nah, I think the longest I've ever taken was 7 days. Anyway, Handsome Kyle will hopefully be back the next time we have a greenhouse episode, but we've missed him the last few. He's sending me pictures though from Manhattan, so I think he's having a great time up there. So just to briefly reintroduce, we're in season 7, which is supposed to answer the question, how do we become more like Jesus? And one of the conditions for our spiritual formation is self-awareness. And as I've talked about here and in the book and on the website for 3 or 4 years now, double knowledge, knowing God and knowing ourselves, those two things are essential if we want to become deep disciples and we want to become more mature in our walk. And self-knowledge is something that is routinely panned either overtly or covertly in modern Christianity. And so we're trying to resurrect that in some way and encourage ourselves and others who are following Jesus, apprenticing with Jesus, to spend the time really digging into their own hearts, because that's a necessary prerequisite for becoming more like Jesus from the inside out. And so we're in this little mini-series of season 7, uncovering our true ideas about God. Not our intellectual beliefs, but the ideas from which we actually operate. And it's been fascinating to write. It's sort of the culmination for me of a 5-year journey exploring this philosophical world of ideas and their impact on humans and on the world. And we're just into the first one. And I'm not sure how many ideas of God I'm going to tackle, but the first one is that the idea that God isn't good all the time. That, in fact, many of us actually operate from the idea that we don't really think God is safe or that he is good, and that our hearts actually bubble that up. So I find this to be one of the richest sections of our journey so far over our now 7 seasons. But I know that you and I have dialogued offline about this episode, and it has not necessarily been as pleasant for you. So as always, we're turning it over to you to facilitate the greenhouse episode, and would love to hear your thoughts on God's goodness, Doc.
I do think that God is very, very good, and I believe that idea is down in my heart. But when I tried to prepare my typical responses and questions to help guide and facilitate this greenhouse, I had the hardest time. I think I went through 3 or 4 different drafts and documents and got so frustrated and exhausted. And I called you and we played phone tags. I wanted to try to bounce ideas off you. And then we spoke and I shared what a struggle I was having with it. And it's because, to me, there is such friction and disconnect between my idea of God's goodness and what I experience when I look at the world. Now, of course, there have been times of intense pain in my life, and there have been times where I questioned and doubted God's goodness toward me. But on the whole, my life has been really protected, I would say. Truly blessed, not in a kind of trite hashtag blessed, Hallmark card type of way. But God's favor has been on me, and I have been just extraordinarily fortunate in that sense. I have an incredible wife. I have wonderful kids. I've mostly got my health. God has provided time and time again. But what I struggle with, I would say, is the pain and injustice that I see in the world, at the innocents whose blood is crying out. Brian, you've pointed again and again to the fact that a person engaged in deep discipleship strives to uncover their ideas, and then works through them in authenticity and community, and experiences God's goodness through that process. So that's what I'm trying to do here, is to work through some of those things with you and with our audience. And you mentioned to me offline that sharing some of my own angst and uncertainty could be a good, healthy thing. So, despite the fact that I do look at the world that God has made, and I look at my children, and I look at my wife and my family and the life that I have, and I have to conclude God is good. He is so deeply good to have made these things, to have given these things, to have such good gifts. But I see friends who are hurting, or I see family members struggling, or I read about children picking through a garbage dump today for food, or sold into trafficking, or whatever it might be. And that unfairness just truly makes me question a father who would give me bread but give them a stone, would give me a fish but give them a snake, to refer back to Jesus' teachings. I question why God created us the way we are to begin with, so weak and prone to sin, knowing full well we'd fail in the garden and eat the fruit, knowing the pain and suffering that would follow, knowing how many would never find their way to him, but setting it up this way anyway. And I question sometimes how good that really was. But I still come back to this truth, this belief that God must be good because of all he's made and all he's done, because of the cross, because of the empty tomb, because of my family, because of friends like you and Kyle. So I can only imagine that his heart breaks even more than mine, and trust that somehow through this mystery that I can't grasp, some solution I have not yet begun to fathom, that it will all work out in the end. And one day I will understand the Lord's goodness in full. But until then, it's a mystery. But it's, as you told me, Brian, this struck me powerfully. You said the joy of the Lord and the pain of the Lord can be held simultaneously, that we can at once celebrate God's goodness and rest in his peace and joy, even while feeling deeply the pain and hurt of the world, and not longing for it to be better, for it to be what it was always meant to be. So I guess let's start with that place of tension. Is this honest hope and honest fear coexisting? Is this a healthy place to be? Could it be this is even a necessary place on this journey into deep discipleship?
I think of somebody like Mother Teresa. Now, I've not studied her life, but my understanding is she served for decades amidst some of the most difficult life circumstances anybody could imagine, right? The slums of India. And I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Slumdog Millionaire, but I think it paints a really visceral image of what life in those areas is like. And she served faithfully, compassionately, treated people who aren't normally treated as human beings like human beings. And yet, my understanding is she struggled with long bouts of depression and had, severe inner angst and concerns and inner suffering while she ministered to those who were suffering. And when you look at somebody like that, who dedicated her life to serving the very, 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 very least of these, I think it gives you an interesting picture of the deep disciple. So Dallas Willard somewhere wrote that God is the most joyful being in the universe. And when you look at creation, you see that joy springing about, right? There's, I think it's in The Magician's Nephew, Lewis writes about Aslan creating a different world from Narnia, and the imagery that he uses is just Aslan bounding about, expressing childlike abundance at what he's creating in this new world. And when you look at creation and the variety of butterflies and caterpillars and birds and beasts and fish, and you can't help, I think, as somebody who follows Jesus, to step back and say, God is a joyful being who has given us an extraordinary world and universe to enjoy. And yet, he's close to the brokenhearted. And yet, he's a fellow sufferer with us in our sufferings. And I think it's difficult for us in the West to kind of grasp that because we tend to think we deserve comfort, and that's the prime characteristic. But I think when we look at Jesus, we see somebody who laughed and was overjoyed and had a sense of humor and was extraordinarily compassionate at the same time, wept and got frustrated, irritated, angry, and that's the human experience. And so I think part of becoming depth is, yes, holding the joy of the Lord and the peace that Isaiah 26:3 and other places promises, with the reality that we live in a desperately broken world that we can't fix in and of ourselves, but we are supposed to be part of that solution.
And that's a powerful point about God being the most joyful being in the universe. That is something that I don't think I would have come to myself. In fact, sometimes when I'm praying to the Lord, if I'm feeling particularly intimate or personal with him, I might say, "Morning, Father, how was your day? How was your night?" And then sometimes I feel guilty for asking, because it's like when you ask that for somebody that is going through some kind of traumatic event, how they're doing. So I think, oh, God's day must have been terrible. I mean, I'm thinking about all the people pouring out their grief and their pain to him, and the millions of prayers of suffering coming up, and just seeing all of that brokenness over the world. But at the same time, God spent the morning spinning out a new nebula on the far reaches of the galaxy. He saw his children walking for the first time. He saw the joy of marriages coming together that he ordained. He saw the beauty of life in the kingdom and his angels accomplishing their purposes, and all these wonderful, beautiful, joyful, incredible, miraculous, transformational things across the world. And so I have to believe that you're right. There's this joy, even while I'm sure he feels sorrow at the state of the world. And it's important for us too, as people, to embrace both sides, not strictly to feel that the positive is the only thing that is healthy to feel or express, but we should be making spaces for them. But I feel like that's pretty rare. We might profitably look at this from a behavioral psychology stance. There's a name for this. Forcing an optimistic frame over genuine pain is known as toxic positivity. Research in cognitive science shows that this kind of emotional suppression, it doesn't erase negative emotions. It actually amplifies them, both psychologically and physiologically. We feel it in our bodies. But it does reinforce what you've been exploring, and I think what we're talking about right here. So I guess my question for you is, why do you think modern church culture and the Western Christian experience, as we largely experience it now, has become so allergic to the language of lament when our foundational scriptures are so full of it? What are we afraid will happen if we let people sit in their unresolved grief or anger at God?
I think every church has its own culture, and I have not been to enough churches to conclude that a lack of lament or cultures that prohibit or look down on doubt are universal. I don't know that. That would be pretty characteristic of the churches I've been a part of over my life, but I'm positive, I'm sure, that there are church congregations in the West where lament, sorrow, doubt, debate, even some deconstruction is welcomed and invited. I agree. I don't think it's the norm. We have a consumerism. We have extremely image conscious. We have power structures in the Western church that basically emulate other power structures outside of the church. And so if we agree with the assumption that on the main Western church culture is more surface driven and very focused on numbers and baptisms and conversions and bums and seats versus depth, then I think primarily we're talking about the church just absorbing a very Western corporate set of ideas. Hey, we need to grow. We need to build buildings. We need to show numbers. We need to have our KPIs and our metrics. And those are those are all surface things that don't allow for depth. But I think this is probably what, and we've referred to this book a number of times, The Critical Journey by Hagberg and Gulich. They theorize that there are 6 stages of discipleship, and that the modern church institution covers the first 3, but has no desire and is ill-equipped to guide and support anybody through stages 4, 5, and 6. And stages 4, 5, and 6, especially 4, are messy, and they're particular, and they're filled with angst and doubt and the dark night of the soul. Those deep emotions, those questions don't fit into a Western Christianity that has largely become systematized and is very much built on ideas of efficiency and profitability and scalability. Deep discipleship is not really any of those things. So that tension, I think, the institutional priorities overtake the needs of the individual and just don't make room for the soul searching that is really necessary for depth.
One of the things, as you've pointed out many times, that makes Soil and Roots different is that we approach things not strictly through a theological lens, but often through an anthropological lens about what it means to be human and how that impacts us as people, as human beings. So that might be a useful way to look at this as well. Though throughout history, rituals of mourning and lamentation have been vital for community cohesion. Anthropologists have found that they allow a tribe or a community, a group, to actually process trauma together. So when we do the opposite, when we're alone and isolated, when we privatize our doubt and grief, it's to the individual's detriment. And anthropologists have found this throughout studies. So anthropologists look at how rituals of lament or mourning or grief or whatever it might be actually preserve the survival of a community. There's a French sociologist, Émile Durkheim, and he argued that these kind of rituals create social solidarity. They bind a community together. He calls it collective effervescence. I like that term, effervescence. This kind of shared energy that binds a group together by having these shared emotional experiences. So I think when somebody asks, is God good? Oftentimes they're expressing pain rather than really looking for a philosophical argument. Of course, if they come to me, I'm going to probably come back with a 12-page treatise about, why precisely God is good.
What?
But
You?
I'm reminded of the story you shared, Brian, in the last episode about your friend's sister. You said you would call her Jane, who worked with vulnerable populations, saw their suffering, and ultimately concluded that God must be cruel or powerless. She was in pain. She was hurting from the injustice and the darkness she had witnessed. And I often feel that kind of pain. And the response is, often a cry of the heart, not just of the head to need to be convinced. So how do we shift our response from defending God, giving a defense and an apology, apologetics, to offering a presence when people are going through this kind of doubt, lament, to bearing witness to their pain? And what do we lose as a community when we no longer know how to lament collectively?
Well, you're covering a lot of ground there, like you normally do. So let's back up one step. Again, at Soil and Roots, we primarily focus on the inner life and not the theological belief statements. And that is not because, I've disclaimed this 1,000 times, but I'm a big fan of theology. I'm a big fan of doctrine. I believe in taught, preached truth. At the same time, my primary concern in terms of Soil and Roots is that we do very little inspection and understanding of the heart. And yet that seems to be what God is really after. God desires our hearts, not just our intellectual belief statements. So we distinguish pretty clearly here between our intellectual beliefs and the hidden areas of our heart, our operating systems. And so when we talk about God's goodness, to your question, I agree that often what is spoken, the questions that we ask are not normally what our hard questions are. Anybody who's been through marriage counseling, they'll always joke and they'll tell the husband, hey, what your wife says is not really what's going on. So you need to learn how to attune to her and ask curious questions and help her articulate what's actually going on in her heart. I think that's true for both genders. So to your point, when somebody is asking whether or not God is good, the heart cry very oftentimes is for somebody to come and know me. That's what we're pleading for. Because most people recognize we live in a world of good and evil, and that things are broken and they're not yet fully fixed and resolved yet. But when somebody is asking those sort of very difficult theological questions, which scholars have wrestled with for thousands of years, and we're certainly not going to resolve here today, we need to recognize that oftentimes that heart cry is not a theological question. It is, somebody please be with me. Because that's where the heart learns goodness, right? It's not a theological, intellectual question. It's a passionate plea for withness, because we experience God's goodness through relationship and experience. So trying to answer these questions intellectually, I think, is a challenge. So this is why we've tested the greenhouse model. I have argued, continue to do so, that we have lost, for the most part, any real sense of long-term small community in the West. And that's just not in the church, although it certainly is in the church. But, there's a great article that was written 5 or 6 years ago called "Where Did All the Bowling Leagues Go?" And think about the question. We just don't do small community stuff that much anymore, especially as we get into our childbearing years. And then you get out of that and you're into the empty nesters, and all of a sudden you're trying to figure out how to rebuild community. And even if we do have some sense of community, is that community comfortable with doubt, derision, dissent, deconstruction, lament, and not just, you get to share for 2 weeks and then we're moving on? If we sit and watch the news every day in isolation, our hearts are going to be convinced that God isn't very good. But if we are deeply embedded with others who are sojourning to become more like Jesus, and through that community are experiencing being known by others and by God, that is what validates that truth, and that's what allows our hearts to rest. In the absence of that, and I think living in a culture of absence of that, these questions bubble up and continue to go unresolved.
Well, and I think we tend to see doubt in negative terms. Being called a doubting Thomas is not exactly a compliment, as if we really would be better off being those who believe without seeing. So doubt can be seen as something that needs to be squashed or quickly solved or avoided entirely. There was a Barna study that came out in 2017, and of those polled who identified as Christians, 65% said that they had experienced a prolonged period of doubt in their lives. But that means that 35% actually declared they had never had a long period of doubt in their lives. While I'm somewhat envious of that and also somewhat skeptical, just being honest.
I'm dubious.
Yeah, I can also see them answering that question with some pride. Nope, no doubt here. I've never doubted a day in my life. But here's the truth. I think we can reframe doubt as a form of intimacy. You don't rage at, cry out to, or question somebody you don't care about. Asking, is God good, implies you expect him to be, or you desperately want him to be. This is a kind of engagement, not abandonment. It's a way to press in. So to lament, cry, or even scream at God is to assume that he's listening. It's to care deeply. Let's go back to attachment theory, something that you've explored in a number of other episodes, originally developed by John Bowlby for developmental and behavioral psychology. So as a reminder from previous episodes, a secure attachment style is characterized by the belief that the caregiver provides a safe haven. So in other words, if we have a child that is securely attached, they feel entirely free to express those negative emotions, anger, distress, protest toward the parent, because ultimately they've got confidence that the relationship can take it. It can withstand this kind of conflict and tension. It's only in insecure attachments that a child suppresses that anger or fear, pushes it down out of fear of abandonment or retaliation. So questioning is God good isn't a sign of detachment. Psychologically speaking, raging at the heavens is the hallmark of a secure spiritual attachment. It means the believer trusts God enough to handle them at their rawest, most vulnerable reality. But shutting down these questions, in contrast, implies an insecure attachment. So, do you think we should reframe the question, is God good, and similar expressions of doubt, not as a sign of a failing faith, but as the sign of a deeply serious, engaged, attached faith that does not want to settle for easy answers?
I'm not sure that when we ask, is God good, if that's always the question. Again, because we're distinguishing between the head and the heart. It's the whole Kurt Thompson quote that we're born into this world looking to know someone and looking to be known by somebody who has no other agenda than to know us because we exist, right? Our hearts don't want to be exploited. We don't want to be abandoned. We don't want to be betrayed. We want to be known intimately, deeply by somebody who just is overjoyed that we're in the world. And if we live in that security, in that sense, we can withstand a lot of craziness, right? If we don't have that secure inner attachment, then these types of questions become deeply plaguing, difficult, unanswerable questions. So I'm trying to avoid the theological arguments for God's goodness just because there's wildly better resources than here to address that question. What I'm trying to ping into is the question underneath the question, which is normally unspoken by myself and others. So when I'm suffering, or to your point that you made earlier, when we see others suffering on the news and we say, gosh, is God good? Well, there's the theological answer, which is he created creation good and humans screwed it up and God is still overcoming and one day it'll be made right? The C.S. Lewis quote, everything that's sad is going to become untrue. So we trust in that hope. While we're in the mushy middle, I'm not sure the answer is to try to rush to a theological dictionary or apologetics to address that, but to rather recognize our anthropology, our humanity. So, yes, it is very healthy for the question to be asked, but I think the deeper response is for the person trying to answer the question to attune to the heart of the questioner and to engage them in a way that they experience God's goodness. And this is where I think in our jet setting, over busy, overcomplicated, overcommitted, media, digital saturated life, we've just lost a tremendous amount of sense of what it means to be human and what humans actually need. The closeness, the intimacy, the withness that God offers. But let's be frank, he normally offers it through people. We are the primary conduits through which the kingdom comes, like it or not. And the kingdom comes primarily through experiences and relationships. And that means that we, as followers of Jesus, as we become deeper people, invite others into those depths. And that's primarily, is not only, but it is primarily through how we experience one another long term. And I realize what I'm saying is terribly contrary to much of what's going on in evangelicalism. And again, I support it. It's fine. I like apologetics. I like good preaching. I like good teaching. That stuff can be formative. But my suspicion is there are millions of hearts that are quietly asking, is God good? Because they're relationally disconnected from him and from others, even if their theology is good.
So it comes back again to community, to experiencing God with others and
certain types of community, meaning it's just it's not a small group thing. Like I agree with those who assess the small group movement and say this has largely been a failure because there's no more disciples now after 50 years of testing it than before. It's not that they're all bad. And, we had a great small group when we were in our 20s, and I think they're still together. So there are some benefits. But if the community itself is not intentionally coming together to embody the 5 elements that we've talked about, time, habit, community, intimacy, and instruction, then it's just a gathering. But if we are coming together for the purpose of becoming more like Jesus, that requires to be authentic. And that's a critical word here that we haven't spent a ton of time on. Meaning, my perception of God is he most appreciates us when we are raw and authentic with him, even if it's messy. even if it's messed up, even if it's corrupted. Meaning he would rather have us in our real state than he would have us in some sort of image conscious state. But it is very difficult in the West these days to be that raw and authentic because we are just swamped, immersed in image and persona and looks, comparisons. I just think Jesus would much rather we come to him in our messed up state. We've talked about the fact that true discipleship should be more like an AA meeting than what we typically experience in church. And if you're going to successfully move from being an addict to a recovering addict, I don't think you can get there without being very raw and very authentic, very routinely, in a group that you are safe and that you can trust and that they're going to be with you even when you have really, really bad days.
And it can be so hard to find that and embrace it and just being real, find the level of comfort to feel safe to do that with other people.
I'm going to be really tick people off here, but the Western church's obsession with multiplication is a primary reason why it's hard to find. At least where I live, most of the churches here that have some sort of discipleship effort force them to split after 6 months or a year because they need to multiply what they think is multiplication. But in many cases, it takes a year or two to develop the inner safety to be raw and authentic and real and vulnerable and to question God's goodness in a group. It takes time. This is why the greenhouse model is so different from much of what the West experiences and why I'm an advocate of it. But I find it frustrating because I think the modern missionary movement has wonderful benefits and it has certainly brought people to Jesus, but there's a dark side to it. And one of the dark sides is it works against depth. It works against disciple making. When you're trying to make converts and, take people in a group and split them out as fast as possible, that's not a recipe for depth. It's a recipe for breadth. And I don't really see the importance of that because a shallow breadth can be very, very dangerous. And in fact, I think that's what we see.
And as you said, you put it as being in the mushy middle of the story, this place where we're in between, where things are still not fully resolved, not fully solved. It's this kind of wilderness wandering of Israel. I'm reminded of the wall in the critical journey, Hegberg and Gulick, again, where you have left your old reality, but you haven't yet arrived fully at the new one. This kind of liminal space, as the anthropologist Victor Turner calls it, a place where easy answers are gone. The liminality is this kind of in-betweenness, and it is mushy, it's messy, it's vulnerable, and it requires, I don't know if acceptance is the right word, but an understanding and a recognition of not having to solve everything, but being with others and supporting them and yourselves in an authenticity of where you are. Being comfortable saying, I don't know if God is good right now, but we're here together and we're going to talk about this together. It's that solidarity of the wilderness. You said we rush to Romans 8:28. We quote cliches. We attempt to defend God. We try to solve the problem. However, the scriptures themselves seem remarkably comfortable with lament, wrestling, grief, confusion, uncertainty, and even protest, end quote. So it made me think, and I'll put this question to you, but if God is big enough to handle the universe, why are we so protective of him when people express anger or disappointment? Who are we actually trying to protect when we shut down those hard questions, God or our own comfort? And maybe you can recap, the greenhouse space and what we're suggesting might be an answer to that, to press into those things together.
So I just want to make sure I understand the core of the question. The question is, why are we reluctant to press into our doubts and dissensions?
Yeah. And why do we view that as somehow a lack of faith, or like we are attacking God when we should accept it on faith that he is good all the time?
Yeah, I think to me, because the Western Church functions from the assumption that to be a mature Christian is to be correct, is to make sure we have the correct belief statements and the correct doctrine. We better be correct on women in ministry. We better be correct on communion. We better be correct on baptism. We better be correct on Reformed versus Arminian. I mean, pick your poison. There's 1,000 different issues that we argue over. But by and large, that's built into the mechanism of the Western Church. I mean, what's the prime, the assumed prime best moment of the week is a 30-minute sermon. Like the whole thing is based on intellectual assumption of information. That's why we go to church. For a Protestant, that's the primary reason why you go to church. They hear the sermon. You sing a few songs and you maybe take communion and you throw some money in the kitty, but by and large you're there, and that's how we judge the church. We stay at the church whether we like the pastor, whether or not he delivers a good sermon. The whole system is built on, do we intellectually agree with the key Bible teacher? And our group is only a group because we do have some sort of shared belief statements. Again, I'm not arguing against good orthodoxy, good doctrine. I'm saying, but if you look at the underlying ideas that drive the institutions, they're all heady. So to question those things, or to lament those things, or to deconstruct from some of those things, in many cases will get you kicked out, maybe of the church itself, but certainly in certain inner circles, because you're no longer towing the intellectual company line. And I just think it's missing the point. I think Jesus, I've been meditating on Psalm 51, 5 and 6. Everybody knows 5, but verse 6 is, behold, you desire wisdom in the innermost being, in the hidden parts you will make me know truth. So again, we have these words knowing. This is not like, oh, I just have to agree to the right biblical facts. This is an intimate, heartfelt, inner experience of knowing wisdom and truth. And that only happens through experiences and relationships. So when we live in a culture, church culture, that is largely based on making sure that we adhere to certain facts versus who we are becoming in community, you end up with a very shallow, consumer-centric Christianity, which is what I think we have.
I'm going to go off script for a minute here, and just share vulnerably that I'm no doubt guilty of exactly what I'm being critical of here. And that even with this episode and trying to prepare for it, I've relied on research and statistics and pulling in voices from anthropology and behavioral psychology and historical literature, and that's good and beneficial and helpful. And I think your responses have been illuminating for me and others as we discuss this. But that's not where my heart is, right? My heart doesn't really change through researching this question. And the reason I struggled so much to formulate my responses to your episode is that I don't have it all figured out. I don't remotely. I come to this question, is God good? And my heart breaks open even as it's filling with joy. It's full of pain even as it's full of peace. I hurt and ache and long to know God in his fullness and to have that penetrate my inner being in the way that you're talking about, where even if I couldn't explain why God is always good all the time, my heart would rest in that so securely that there would be no discomfort. And maybe that's impossible in this world, but I want to at least be authentic enough to lay before you and others that I don't know. I don't have answers to these questions. All I can do is ask questions and ask more about those. But maybe there's beauty in that mushy middle, in that messiness. Maybe there's truth and life and that kind of vulnerability before God. You actually brought in 2 Lewis quotes already, so I really don't have to do this, but I always have a C.S. Lewis quote ready, and it actually goes with this. The quote I found was, quote, May it be the real I who speaks. May it be the real thou the I speaks to. We must lay before him what is in us, not what ought to be in us. End quote. That hit me hard, because it's easy to put on another hat. It's easy to slide the mask into place. It's easy to try to act like you have it together and figure it out. Whether talking with somebody else or talking with God, it's hard to truly be ourselves, because speaking for myself, the real I, it's messy is a nice word for it. The real I is sometimes scared and distraught and sorrowful.
I appreciate you sharing that. And I think your grief and tension that you feel about the hurts and harms of the world is God's heart. I think that's probably a gift to you, that you have a strong sense of others suffering, and it bothers you that they're suffering. I think it bothers Jesus that they're suffering. So that may not be a comforting way to look at it, because it suggests that you're going to be experiencing those things for the rest of your life. But I think that's what depth is. I think being a deep disciple means we hold multiple emotions at the same time, and we become increasingly comfortable with paradox, and we become increasingly comfortable with unanswered questions. I don't think Job should be the proof text for every situation. I think it's overused, but there is something to God's final response in that book that is worth noting, which is that we aren't him, and that he is in control even when things seem out of control. But he desires us to experience his safety in the midst of that, not get all the intellectual answers. I mean, I've asked more questions in the last 5 or 6 years of my life, and 80% of them continue to be unanswered, while I still have a deepening sense of Jesus's delight in me and care for me. In some ways, the more securely attached I get to the Father, the more questions that go unanswered.
I'm glad to be here in the muck with you, Brian.
We're in the muck together.
That's right.
Well, thanks again for prepping so completely. And I feel bad in one sense that it was what you described in an email, the most difficult episode you've ever had to review. But also, again, I think your heart's in such a wonderful place. I do think, though, we really want our comfort, and I'm not entirely sure that's the Christian life. I think the Christian life is holding a lot of things together at one time, but at the same time, experiencing God's goodness and having our heart resolve that question and rest in his security. And all I'm saying is I think that's supposed to come primarily through our relationships with other people, and we need to recapture that. Well, thank you for being with us today as we really went under the surface today. I think there's a lot to think about here, a lot to contemplate, and hopefully you're having discussions and experiencing one another wherever you are around the world. And we're so glad that you're part of our Soil and Roots community as we explore the deeper things of God and of ourselves as we seek to join with him in the increase of his kingdom. If you want more information on Soil and Roots, you can check us out at www.soilandroots.org. soilandroots.org. If you're on social media, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Soil and Roots Podcast, Soil and Roots Podcast. And you can also check us out on, Substack and YouTube at just Soil and Roots. Substack continues to be one of our primary ways of communicating. So if you want to read some of the things that we explore there's, coming up on 100 pretty lengthy articles there, pretty good body of work that you can check out. Just search, like I said, for Soil and Roots there. If you'd like to financially support this work, you can do so safely and securely at soilandroots.org. We are an entirely donor-funded ministry, and so we would love to have your backing as we continue to probe the depths of Jesus and ourselves, and we invite you to financially participate in this work. All of your gifts are tax-deductible. Tim Boswell facilitated today's episode and came up with these very difficult probing questions. Kyle will be back with us next time. The episode is produced by Zach Fisher, and you can always check out his music on Spotify at FishU. Thanks for being with us, and we'll see you next time for another idea of God that we often wrestle with. See you later.